After the Battle of Antietam, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia marched back into Virginia, leaving George McClellan and the Army of the Potomac in Maryland. Once into Virginia, Lee spread out his army with Thomas Stonewall Jackson's wing in the Valley and Longstreet's wing stationed around Culpeper. Abraham Lincoln was tired of McClellan's stalling and slow movements, even though the general had made plans for invading Virginia and pushing on to Richmond. The Army of the Potomac began moving into Virginia, passing to the east of the Blue Ridge. Abraham Lincoln took a risk and replaced an army commander during an active campaign, replacing McClellan with Ambrose Burnside. The new commander had suggested to McClellan that a push towards Richmond through Fredericksburg would force Lee to come after the much larger Army of the Potomac, and now that he commanded the army, he would implement this plan. The Army of the Potomac would form near Warrenton and New Baltimore, then proceed to Fredericksburg, where they would cross the Rappahannock River. As Burnside waited for Lincoln's approval, he set about reorganizing the Army of the Potomac. He would create 3 grand divisions with 2 infantry corps, cavalry, and artillery in each one. The Right Grand Division would be commanded by Major General Edwin Sumner and be composed of the 2nd and 9th Corps. The Left Grand Division was given to Major General William Franklin, containing the 1st and 6th Corps, and the Center Grand Division would be commanded by Major General Joseph Hooker, containing the 3rd and 5th Corps. The Reserve Grand Division contained the 11th and 12th Corps. In preparation for his move to Fredericksburg, Burnside dispatched Captain Ulrich Dahlgren with a small cavalry force to approach the town and check on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad that ran between Aquia Creek and Fredericksburg. Dahlgren performed great service in testing the fords along the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg and even went into the town, dispersing the small Confederate force stationed there. Then they headed to the northeast to inspect the railroad. In this instance, Dahlgren went beyond his orders and burned a couple of bridges in that area, railroad bridges that Burnside hoped to use to supply his troops from Aquia Creek. Nevertheless, on November 14th, Burnside got his plan approved by Abraham Lincoln, although it was with reluctance on the side of the president. On November 15th, Edwin Sumner's Right Grand Division began their march with the 2nd Corps in the lead. On that same day, to confuse General Lee as to what Burnside's plans were, a cavalry and infantry force launched an attack on Confederates at Rappahannock Station. Lee began to think that Burnside was going to force his way across the waterway and attack his dispersed forces near Culpeper. Longstreet put his men on alert in case of Union forces heading south toward their position. Burnside also ordered a feint to occur at White Sulphur Springs to further confuse the Confederate forces and make them think that the Union Army intended to push south. On November 16th, the other 2 Grand Divisions began their march. The Left Grand Division pushed towards Stafford Courthouse, and the Center Grand Division marched to Hartwood. On November 17th, Lee was still uncertain about Burnside's disposition, but he quickly found out. The 2nd Corps was at Falmouth by now, a difficult march over muddy roads, but the Blue troops persevered. Union cavalry excellently screened the movements of Sumner's men, blocking both Confederate infantry and cavalry from breaking through their screen. Colonel William Ball of the 15th Virginia Cavalry came into contact with 2nd Corps troops as they approached Falmouth. By engaging with the enemy, he determined that a large body of Federals were approaching toward Fredericksburg and quickly informed Lee. He began evacuating some citizens who were willing to leave. The town housed 150,000 pounds of tobacco and a stockpile of cotton bales. Ball burned the cotton bales and threw the tobacco into the river. But to his dismay, the Federals did not pursue across the river. He had destroyed the material for seemingly no reason, but he had no way to know that the town was not in immediate danger. It was now November 18th. Lee wagered that Burnside's ultimate destination was Fredericksburg, so he performed 2 important actions. First, he dispatched 2 of Longstreet's divisions, one under Lafayette McLaws and the other under Robert Ransom, toward Fredericksburg to block a possible crossing of the Rappahannock River. Next, he sent Jeb Stuart north to see if the Federal Army remained near Warrenton. Stuart reported that it was on the move to Falmouth, and this confirmed Lee's suspicions. Fredericksburg was the ultimate destination. Stuart and his cavalry performed hard duty over the next couple of days, operating behind Union lines, engaging with their Federal counterparts, and capturing prisoners and what supplies they could. Lee did not feel comfortable positioning his troops at Fredericksburg for a major engagement. He believed the heights on the north side of the river superior to those on the south. so he wanted to bring on an engagement on the North Anna River, where he would have a better advantage in terrain. So the rest of Longstreet's troops were to march to the southeast. He also called on General Jackson to link up with the rest of the army. At first, Jackson refused, saying the Federals were reinforcing near Harper's Ferry, possibly for an attack down the valley. But Lee convinced him that the larger Union threat at Fredericksburg needed his entire army. Sumner had watched a cow cross the Rappahannock River in about 3 feet of water and asked Burnside permission to cross with his forces to capture the town. Burnside insisted that the pontoons would arrive soon, and he would cross when they arrived. Burnside was unaware of the problems Halleck and others were having attempting to get the pontoons to the Union Army. By November 19th, the Left Grand Division was at Stafford Courthouse, and the Center Grand Division was at Hartwood. The pontoons were considerably late by this point, partially because no one secured their transportation at many locations. Plus, the horseflesh needed to pull the wagons were partially wild, and the bridles arrived disassembled, which ate up more time. Davis convinced Lee that the crops between the Rappahannock and the North Anna were more important than stringing Burnside out in advance, so Lee countermanded his previous orders and put all of Longstreet's infantry on the road to Fredericksburg. On November 21st, Burnside sent a message to the mayor of Fredericksburg, Montgomery Slaughter, asking for the town's surrender. The mayor refused to surrender the town. Lee intervened and assured Burnside that the town would not be used for military purposes, and pulled troops out of the town by November 23rd. While all of this went on, Lee's troops filed onto the heights south of Fredericksburg, and Jackson began to leave the valley. Stonewall did think he could do greater service in the valley, like he had earlier that year, but the well over 100,000 troops of Ambrose Burnside could easily overwhelm the roughly 40,000 men that Lee possessed at that time. They traveled south to Newmarket and suffered greatly for want of shoes. Some of the men wore leather moccasins, but in the wet November weather that plagued both armies, the pieces of leather became brittle when the men attempted to dry them. They decided to throw them away rather than risk more harm to their feet. Then they traveled east to Madison Courthouse, then across the Rapidan River to Orange Courthouse. Jackson then traveled ahead of his troops to Lee to inform him of the unit's progress. By December 1st, all of Jackson's men were at Fredericksburg, having marched 175 miles in 12 days, including 2 days resting at Madison Courthouse. With Longstreet guarding the heights, Lee placed Jackson's troops at the fords to the east of town to protect his army from a possible flank attack by Burnside. After consulting with Abraham Lincoln, Ambrose Burnside decided on a frontal assault, believing that the Confederate center would be weak since many of Jackson's units were downstream guarding the fords. He gave the order for the pontoon bridges to be built. The 50th New York Engineers, the 15th New York Engineers, and the U.S. Engineer Battalion began their construction job at 1 a.m. on December 11th, while infantry units protected them from the banks. Above them, on the heights north of town, 147 artillery pieces aimed their guns to protect the builders from enemy infantry and artillery. General William Barksdale commanded his Mississippians in the town, and the division commander Lafayette McLaws assigned them the task of hindering the building of the pontoon bridges. At 2 a.m., Barksdale sent a message to McLaws informing him that work had begun. At 4:30 a.m., he received another message from Barksdale, stating the bridges were being constructed. McLaws fired 2 artillery pieces in rapid succession, the signal to the army that the enemy was crossing the river. The Army of Northern Virginia began to take their battle positions. The first major Confederate volleys occurred at 5:15 a.m. in an effort to stop the engineers. Rebels hid in buildings and behind well-constructed barriers to deliver devastating volleys into the blue troops. As the day wore on, the pontoon bridges downstream made headway, but the ones closest to the town faced a stalemate from the Mississippians across the river. The engineers had lost an incredible amount of men by midday, so it was decided to move infantry across the river in boats. The 7th Michigan, with the 19th Massachusetts supporting them, rode across the water at about 3 p.m., with rebel bullets smashing into the wood and flesh. Miraculously, the Michiganders made it across and began fighting with the Mississippians. The boats returned to the other side to transport more across. When the Michiganders got across, they were ordered not to form into battle line, but to rush to the rifle pits of the enemy and take over the barriers concealing the rebel infantry. Major Thomas Hunt divided his storming party into groups of 5 to 10 men, each of which would identify a building used as sharpshooters' nests. surround it, and neutralize it by killing or capturing the troops inside. With a bridgehead created by the 7th Michigan, Burnside ordered the 89th New York to do the same downriver. Both units cleared away any resistance in their front, and as the Confederates retreated into the city, the Federals pursued. The Michiganders and New Yorkers fought doggedly to hold on to the ground they gained and neutralized many of the threats to the engineers. Plus, the 147 artillery pieces aimed at the town sent many rebels running. The engineers extended the pontoon bridge across the river. The heavy toll taken by the engineers did not stop their persistence in getting the bridges completed. As they built, boats loaded with soldiers crossed the river to help hold on to valuable ground. Colonel Norman Hall, the commander of the brigade fighting through the streets, had been at Fort Sumter when it was fired on by Confederate forces on April 12, 1861. He returned to his home in Michigan to help recruit for the Union war effort. Now he commanded the 7th Michigan and the 19th Massachusetts in urban warfare on the streets of Fredericksburg. The ingenuity of the Union officers and rank-and-file soldiers cannot be overstated. They adapted to a style of warfare unknown to them and succeeded. Before long, most of Hall's brigade and Colonel Joshua Owens' brigade crossed the river. To strengthen the Union foothold, Captain Macy of the 20th Massachusetts organized his men in such a way to form a large rectangle in order to fire in 3 different directions. This pushed back a great deal of Mississippians. Owens' regiments adapted to the situation as well and dispatched companies of men to infiltrate the alleyways and search houses for any enemy activity. This slow progress continued until nightfall, when General Lafayette McLaws ordered Barksdale to withdraw from the town. Longstreet's men took a position on Marye's Heights, and Jackson would fall in to his right, Jackson's lines running parallel to the railroad at Prospect Hill. Although some Confederate soldiers took the initiative to dig in, Lee did not give out a general order to fortify positions. He was sure that Burnside would not launch a frontal assault against his position, and he wanted his men to be able to move quickly up or down the river to confront Burnside. In this respect, Lee was wrong. After constructing the 5 pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River, the Union Army moved across, having to fight their way across the bridges and through the town. Major General Franklin's left Grand Division assembled on the Union left across from Jackson's corps on December 12th. Burnside personally rode across the river and inspected Jackson's position for himself. After seeing the light defenses, he and Franklin decided on a battle plan. They concluded that the enemy's defenses in Franklin's sector were weaker than Sumner's to the right. Franklin recommended a fast strike against Prospect Hill the next morning, but with several caveats. The attack must begin before dawn, so his men could cross the open ground without excessive casualties, and sizable reinforcements from Hooker's Center Grand Division were needed to guard the bridges. Burnside agreed and promised that the orders to this effect would be forthcoming, mounted his horse, and rode back north, possibly to confer with Sumner once again. Burnside had not been sleeping well leading up to December 13th. After he left Franklin, he most likely slept a few hours before rising early on the 13th to formulate his battle plan in order to send it off to his Grand Division commanders. General Franklin, who was under the impression that the orders were to be forthcoming later that night on the 12th, had stayed up awaiting his orders. He sent a telegram to Burnside at midnight about his instructions, but was informed that the orders would be sent when they were ready. A messenger with Franklin's orders rode out from Burnside's headquarters about 6 a.m. The roads were icy and the rider had to travel at a snail's pace and would not reach Franklin until 7:30 a.m., way past the planned dawn attack. Franklin's mind did not ease when he got his orders. What he read did not equal what he and Burnside had discussed the evening before. It read, "Keep your whole command in position for a rapid movement down the old Richmond Road, and you will send out at once a division at least to seize if possible the height near Captain Hamilton's, taking care to keep it well supported and its line of retreat open." Franklin interpreted this as meaning he was to use one division to attack Prospect Hill, while the main thrust would be to his right in General Sumner's sector. Sumner also received ambiguous orders. At dawn on the Confederate side, Lee could hear the sounds of the Union Army, but fog blocked his view. Out of the fog came General Longstreet, and he began warming himself at the roaring fire. General Jeb Stuart arrived next, taking a spot next to the fire. Finally, General Jackson appeared. 2 of his divisions had not made it to the field, those under Jubal Early and D.H. Hill. Longstreet playfully asked Stonewall if he was concerned about the buildup of Federal troops in his front. "Perhaps I'll frighten them after a while," he replied. Jackson suggested to Lee that they should attack before the fog burned off and pin the Union Army between them and the river, but Lee thought that too risky and decided to wear down the Union ranks before launching a strike of their own. Jackson's position was strong, except for a 600-yard swampy area that his men did not want to occupy in the cold December weather. General Gregg's men occupied a position behind the swamp in case Union forces sought to penetrate their line at that point. Stonewall had also assembled 54 artillery pieces to cover the open terrain in front of his infantry. Although General Franklin was aggravated at his orders, he requested no clarification, and Burnside offered none. Instead of attacking Lee's right with tens of thousands of men, Franklin chose to send in 1 division, that under George Meade. Meade's division was an easy choice. It was the most seasoned of the 3 forming the First Corps, and George Meade was a superior general officer. Its numbers had dwindled as the war dragged on. It marched out of Pennsylvania in 1861 with more than 10,000 men, and now counted just 3,400. The addition of 2 large regiments, the 121st and 142nd Pennsylvania, swelled the division's numbers by more than 1,000. Meade's brigades began to file into their assigned positions as Meade and the First Corps commander John Reynolds observed the Confederate infantry locations. It was about 10 a.m. when the 2 generals looked on the rebels on Prospect Hill, and about that time, the artillery shells began dropping into the Union ranks from a lone gun positioned just south of them on the Bowling Green Road. Major John Pelham, an Alabamian and an artillery officer from Jeb Stuart's horse artillery, begged his commander to allow him to take 1 Napoleon and take up an advanced position and fire on the Yankees. Stuart relented, and Pelham went to work. Meade ordered his men to lay down to avoid being hit, but that did not stop the Confederate shells from killing and injuring numerous men. Reynolds scrambled to move as many artillery pieces as he could find to silence Pelham. In all, about 30 pieces of Union artillery dueled with the lone rebel gun. When Federal artillery would find their range on Pelham, the Alabamian would hitch up the piece and move to another location. Pelham scored a direct hit on one gun and another direct hit on a limber chest, along with incapacitating numerous men and horses. Stuart became concerned for his artilleryman and asked him to fall back 3 separate times, but the young man refused. Finally, Stuart sent a Blakely rifle to a location between Jackson's infantry and Pelham's gun to relieve pressure on the single Napoleon, but the Blakely was taken out by a direct hit. Eventually, Union artillery had injured enough men and horses that Pelham was forced to retreat, not to mention Abner Doubleday's division started forming up on Meade's left. The engagement between Pelham and the Union gunners is one of the more famous artillery duels of the war, and it did more than just cause a nuisance for Reynolds. It delayed him from launching an attack for an hour, thus giving Jackson plenty enough time to shore up his position. At 11 a.m., Reynolds directed his artillery at the Confederate line. For 30 minutes, they shelled the rebel positions, but more damage was done in the rear of the Southern battle lines because the Federal artillery was overshooting their mark. Jackson kept his artillery from counterfiring. He knew his artillery was no match for the Yankees' firepower and reserved his ammunition for the infantry that he expected would assault at any moment. At 11:30 a.m., the director of Reynolds' artillery sent word to Reynolds that he had knocked apart the enemy's defenses. Sadly for Reynolds, he was wrong. Meade's division stepped off about 11:30 and crossed the open field toward the enemy. The silence made many blue-clad soldiers believe that the Confederates had left during the bombardment, but the rebel artillery were waiting for them to get within perfect range. Prior to the battle, artillerymen in that sector had stepped off the distance from their guns into the open fields, and even marked 800 yards with stakes and made mental notes of certain landmarks to indicate how far the enemy would be away at each location. When Meade's men stepped within the 800 yards, around 50 artillery pieces opened up from the Confederate line. The roar was deafening, and the shock to the Federal troops so severe that Meade ordered his men to fall back to a small ravine to avoid being destroyed. Now that the rebel artillery had given up their locations, Reynolds ordered his artillery to blast away at the enemy. For over an hour, the two sides flung iron at one another. All the while, Meade's men were caught in a crossfire, laying on their bellies, hugging the ground for safety. When numerous guns and men were silenced on each side, Meade's division once again advanced. The division commander watched his men begin scaling Prospect Hill, but noticed that the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves were not moving. He asked its commander why, and he told Meade that he had been ordered to guard the artillery. Meade ordered the regiment to the front, but it did not fall in line with its fellow regiments, but squeezed into a gap within Conrad Jackson's battle line. Meade's two brigades on the right hit the Confederate line in the gap created by the swampy forest. Sinclair's men were astonished when no small arms fire was directed at them, even though Conrad Jackson's brigade sustained heavy losses from small arms fire and enfilading fire from the Confederate artillery batteries. Meade sent orders to General Jackson to move his brigade to the right towards Sinclair, then sweep his brigade to the left, clearing out the Confederates currently in his front. The messenger rode off to find Jackson, but before the rider arrived, Jackson's horse was shot out from under him, confusing the general in the fall. As the rider saluted, a bullet plunged into his chest, and seconds later, a bullet tore into the skull of Jackson. For the moment, the brigade was leaderless. Because of the chaos of battle, Jackson's second-in-command did not know his commander had been killed, so the brigade hung in a limbo-like state, firing back at the rebels across the railroad. Sinclair, Meade's other brigade commander, was wounded in the foot early in the advance, and the lack of leadership caused his regiments to act on their own until the second-in-command could restore order. Nevertheless, Jackson's brigade duked it out with Archer's Tennesseans, but neither gained a significant advantage. Sinclair's brigade moved over the tracks, finding no enemy in their front. As McGilton's men moved over the railroad, the 37th North Carolina of Lane's brigade delivered volleys into the green 142nd Pennsylvania. The new recruits hid behind the back of the tracks, exposing the flank of the 8th Pennsylvania Reserves. Sinclair's regiments pushed on up Prospect Hill through a dense brush of trees and blackberry bushes. Ahead of them sat Maxcy Gregg's South Carolinians. The men from the Palmetto State didn't expect an attack to impact them, since they were in the second line of defense. So they had stacked arms, sat around, drank coffee, and snacked on what food they had in their haversacks, not hearing or suspecting the Pennsylvanians to be approaching their flank. The 1st South Carolina Rifles, also called Orr's Rifles, were the first to see the movement in the bushes and grabbed their rifles and started shooting. General Gregg, hearing the roar of battle from one of his regiments, rode to them and ordered them to stop firing, that they were firing on friends. The men stacked arms, but then the 1st and 6th Pennsylvania advanced into the South Carolinians, resulting in hand-to-hand combat. Because of his mistake, Gregg was shot on the left side and the bullet severed his spine. His men would take him to a nearby house where he would die the next day. The two rightmost regiments of Gregg's brigade melted away after being hit in their front and in their flank. The 12th, 13th, and 14th South Carolina swung to the right to hopefully stop the oncoming Federals, but the momentum was on the Union side, and they fled to the rear. To the south, Sinclair's men were approaching the flank of Archer's Tennesseans. The 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, who had gotten separated from the brigade, saw their comrades moving up the hill. They disengaged and worked their way up the hill in support. The 2nd and 7th Pennsylvania Reserves released a devastating volley into the 19th Georgia. The Georgians were so taken by surprise that they nearly all fled from their fortified location. The 14th Tennessee to their right berated the men from Georgia and even turned their rifles against them and fired at them for fleeing the battle. However, it wouldn't be long before the 14th also gave way. A Pennsylvania officer found a huddled mass of Confederates in the trench and asked them if they would like to surrender. The Southerners said, "If you'll let us," and they were walked into Union lines. Archer attempted to stop the flank attack by moving the 5th Alabama Battalion to the left of his line, but there was no stopping the Union advance, and the rest of his brigade skedaddled. While Meade's brigades were plunging through the hole in the Confederate line, Meade himself could see that without support, his men would be repulsed and lose all that had been gained in the attack. During the attack, Meade spotted a junior officer racing to the rear in a panic. Meade ordered him back to his men with what one historian called a stream of oaths that had made his temper legendary within the Army. The skulker raised his rifle to take aim at the division commander, but before he could fire, Meade brought his sword down on his head so hard that he snapped the blade in two. This time, when Meade repeated his order to return to the front, the officer complied. With his near-death experience behind him, the division commander called on General Reynolds to move John Gibbon's division up to support his right flank. Gibbon's men had been stuck in a crossfire between the two groups of artillery pieces and hadn't ventured out, but with orders from Reynolds and encouragement from Meade, Gibbon moved out his men. During the advance, Meade attempted to hold his position by sending McGilton's right two regiments against Lane's North Carolinians, who he feared might flank his courageous men. Gibbon's lead brigade, under Brigadier General Nelson Taylor, approached the Tar Heels at the railroad. The Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers halted, and many fell to the ground to shield themselves from the hail of lead. The galling fire was too much for the 11th Pennsylvania and the 83rd New York. They broke for the rear, but luckily for Taylor, Colonel Lyle's brigade came up in support. Taylor moved the 97th New York and the 88th Pennsylvania to the right to make room for Lyle's regiments. The two sides threw lead at one another at a tremendous rate. By this time, Colonel Root was moving his men up, and as he approached the front lines, Lyle's 90th Pennsylvania and 26th New York fell back in order to refill their cartridge boxes. Root was dismayed when they left, and after a short conference with Taylor and Lyle, decided the only way to stay alive was to charge the Confederate position. So Root's men fell into line alongside Taylor and Lyle. The blue-clad troops fixed bayonets and surged toward Lane's men. Hand-to-hand combat broke out, but the Tar Heels gave way. Lane was able to get the 33rd North Carolina to put up some resistance to allow his men to make it to safety, but they were also obliged to fall back. Stonewall Jackson's front line had been destroyed, sent flying by the divisions of General Meade and General Gibbon. But now the Federal troops had to hang on to that costly gained ground. The attack had drained the blue troops of energy and men. The regiments were tangled and organization was lacking. Brigade commanders hurriedly attempted to prepare their men for a defense of the ground, but Stonewall had already sent for reinforcements to fill the gap created by Meade's division. On Jackson's left, Pender's brigade approached Gibbon's tired division, and on the right, the brigades of Atkinson, Hoke, Hayes, Walker, and the Stonewall Brigade, most of them from Early's division, advanced to beat back the Federal breakthrough. As the Pennsylvania reserves rested, two Confederate brigades made their way down the slope of Prospect Hill. Paxton, the commander of the famed Stonewall Brigade, was remembered by his enlisted men as always wanting to enter battle with perfect alignment, and even in the heat of battle would call for the line to be dressed. Today was no exception. He halted the brigade and ordered them to dress. Colonel James Walker got frustrated at Paxton's slowness and moved his brigade through Paxton's lines, causing Paxton himself to become irate. If nothing else, it had disrupted his alignment once again. Walker's men slammed into the Keystone Staters and sent them down the hill. Paxton deployed his brigade toward the right to push back the 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves and the 121st Pennsylvania. On Jackson's left, Thomas's brigade of Georgians were arriving and deployed to the right of Lane's restored brigade. In the meantime, Colonel Root wrote to General Gibbon and asked what he was to do. Gibbon told him to take the slope. Root did as he was told and prepared his men for another assault. His brigade moved against the Georgians and Tar Heels, with help from the 136th Pennsylvania, but the overwhelming numbers of the Confederates forced Root to pull back to the railroad. When the blue troops fell back, Thomas's brigade moved against them, with Lane's Tar Heels following behind. Together they forced Gibbon's men from the railroad. To the south, Atkinson's Georgians had swept away much of the Union resistance in their front, but elements of General Birney's division under General Ward had arrived to support Meade's attack, but they were too late. Now they were simply trying to stop any rebel counterstrikes. When Ward's men reached the railroad, they met Atkinson's Georgians, and a short but bloody engagement began between the two sides. Ward reported that he lost 300 out of the 800 men under his command in less than 5 minutes. The 61st and 60th Georgia flanked Ward's men and drove them from the railroad cut, and continued on. The rebels were driving toward the enemy near the Bowling Green Road, and Atkinson could not stop them. One Union soldier wrote that the Georgians came running out of the woods with no sense of alignment or organization. The brigade swept aside the 57th Pennsylvania, which had been sent to support their sister regiments. Then, 36 cannons opened up on them with canister. The destruction was mesmerizing to the Federals, watching it take place. The volleys from the artillery cut huge swaths out of Atkinson's battle line and momentarily halted them. But when General Robinson's brigade attacked, it was too much for the Georgians. They had been devastated, and their commander, Colonel Atkinson, had been captured in their assault. With the last Confederate brigade driven back across the railroad, the fighting ended between Jackson's Corps and Reynolds' Corps. The fight had been devastating. Gibbon's division lost 1,267 men, and Meade's division lost 1,853. Birney's division, although arriving late in the battle, lost 950, and even Doubleday's division, which sat relatively unengaged, lost 214. On the southern side, the casualties were lighter, but still damaging. A.P. Hill's division lost 1,619 men, being the main force engaged by Reynolds' Corps. However, to illustrate the devastation of the Union artillery, Atkinson's Georgians, part of Early's division, lost 719 killed and wounded, with more than 100 captured, bringing the total casualties of one brigade to over 800. One Union soldier walked the fields in front of the Union artillery and commented that he found dead and dying Georgians, heads off, legs off, and arms. If that was not slaughter, I give up. On the Union left, the troops there were supposed to have launched the main attack against the Confederate line, but a series of miscommunications had resulted in half-hearted assaults against the position held by Stonewall Jackson. Nevertheless, the blue troops had broken the famed Confederates' line, but could not follow up on the breakthrough. On the Union right, where attacks were to be made against James Longstreet's line on Marye's Heights, but be more of a distraction as the main thrust was on the left, Edwin Sumner's troops would launch assault after assault against the well-fortified rebels located on the heights. Although Longstreet's corps spread out across 4 hills, the main thrust by Union forces came at Marye's Heights, occupied by Thomas R. Cobb's Georgians and supported by 30 pieces of artillery. Lying in front of the Union troops once they marched out of the town was a mill race, which forced the blue troops to cross at the designated bridges or boards thrown across the waterway. To add to the Federal soldiers' misery, Confederate skirmishers had pulled up many of the planks across the bridges, forcing the Federals to cross on the stringers. This situation made them easy targets for the Confederate artillery perched on the hill in front of them. Parts of Nathan Kimball's and John Andrews' brigades began to cross the bridges across the mill race. The 8th and 4th Ohio and the 1st Delaware came under Confederate long-range artillery fire with shells bursting over their heads, wounding many of their comrades. Once across, they formed into battle lines and awaited the reinforcements promised to them, but as their officers looked around, they could see no support, and to stand still was to court death. So the commander of the 8th Ohio moved out first, followed by the other 2 regiments toward the hill. One Union soldier stated, "As soon as we rose over the little bank, the missiles came in upon us spitefully, and the air was full of exploding shells. French's men were to pull down any fences or impediments as they moved forward, to allow the support units an uninhibited advance. Once the blue troops came within rifle fire, the Georgians let loose a destructive fire on the 1st Delaware and the 4th Ohio. The 8th Ohio was protected to a certain degree because they were taking cover behind some houses and a blacksmith shop on the Union right. Behind them began to form the rest of Kimball's brigade, the 7th Virginia, 24th New Jersey, 28th New Jersey, and the 14th Indiana. All of those units came under artillery fire once they came into view of the rebel guns. They filed across the mill race regiment by regiment, then formed into battle line for the attack against Cobb's men. The Ohioans and men from Delaware had to pull back to the swell in the middle of the field, where the rebel bullets could not reach them. But this also meant that retreating came with a deadly consequence, so they were stuck there. The rest of Kimball's brigade advanced to the swell, but even though he ordered a bayonet charge as he was carried from the field after being wounded in the thigh, the men did not go past where the rest of the brigade remained. Some of the brigade did venture closer to the stone wall, but it was impossible to hold out against so many projectiles flying through the air. Cobb became concerned that his men were burning through ammunition too quickly and sent word to General Robert Ransom about his concern. The North Carolinian, instead of sending ammunition, sent in part of John R. Cook's brigade. Although the Union troops were pinned down, they still delivered volleys from their prone position, enough to make a dent in the North Carolinians until they made it to the safety of the stone wall. A New Jersey soldier wrote, "Every soldier after firing his piece had thrown himself flat upon the ground to avoid the enemy's bullets, and I did not see how I could possibly load and fire by laying down in that crouching column of men. To stand up boldly was almost certain death. So continuous was the roar of musketry on the firing line, that I do not remember hearing the reports of cannons, but the frightful whiz of heavy missiles passing over our heads every few seconds indicated that the batteries were not silent." Behind Kimball's men came the brigades of John Andrews and Oliver Palmer. Oliver Otis Howard, commander of another division in the 2nd Corps, was happy to see the 132nd Pennsylvania leave. Some of its members had stolen his breakfast that morning. Andrews' men advanced across the open fields towards the impregnable rebel position. There was a rush, a cheer, a crash of musketry, with a tempest of bullets driven straight at their breasts, and the line dissolved. Palmer's brigade charged behind Andrews' men, but likewise got thrown back. The swell flooded with blue troops, regiments became entangled, and officers lost track of their men. Many began to risk their lives and retreat back across those open fields to get away from the constant musketry fired at them by Cobb's men. Cobb himself would be wounded about this time, the projectile hitting a main artery in his leg. He would be carried from the field and bleed out. Zook's brigade of Hancock's division of the 2nd Corps formed on the west side of the mill race. Behind them was the Irish brigade. Zook moved his men out, but the center began to fall behind and the flanks advanced further. His men made it to within rifle range of the Confederates, but the well-protected rebels destroyed Zook's line. The 53rd Pennsylvania did tough it out on the right, however. The Irish brigade formed up across the mill race, many of the regiments forsaking the bridge because it was taking too long to cross, and officers told their men to plunge into the frigid water and make it to the other side. They too approached the stone wall, but got cut down. The 69th New York, with 2 companies detached, went into battle with 168 soldiers. Only 27 returned unharmed. They also fell back, and Caldwell's men formed up to tackle the Confederate line. The 64th and 61st New York had not made it across the mill race before Hancock rode up to Caldwell and ordered his men to attack because the Irish brigade was suffering dearly. The brigade moved forward. They collided with Cobb's men. As they exchanged volleys, the 145th Pennsylvania began to falter, but Caldwell rode up to them and rallied the beleaguered troops, and they returned to the front. It did not take long before the Confederate volleys wore on the blue ranks, and Caldwell was forced to pull his men back to the swale. The 64th and 61st New York was ordered by Hancock to extend the line to the right to protect the prone soldiers in the swale. By this point, 2 divisions had ventured across the open fields and yielded no significant result in their attacks upon the Confederate line. And now, another division of the 2nd Corps, under Oliver Otis Howard, now made their way to the front lines. Generals Howard, Hancock, and Couch met on George Street in Fredericksburg to attempt to make sense of the carnage that their troops were marching into. Part of the discussion focused on the Confederate left and if it could be turned. As the commanders hashed out a plan, more troops were marching into battle. Joshua T. Owen's brigade formed up on the west side of the mill race, with Owen on foot. His horse had been hit by a shell fragment attempting to cross the waterway. The Confederates shored up their line by sending in Kershaw's brigade of South Carolinians to extend the line to the right and the 25th North Carolina to take the place of the 24th North Carolina, while the latter moved to the left. It was a strong line, made even stronger by the Washington artillery perched atop the heights. Their cannon had destroyed lines of blue troops all morning, and they were going to continue to do so as the day wore on. Owen and his men began their march toward the stone wall, but found that the infantry regiments that he had been sent to support had all remained in the swale. His men could go no further without being destroyed by artillery and rifle fire, so Owen instructed his men to pile up the dead bodies on the crest of the swale to provide more cover from the bullets and other projectiles. Owen, in an attempt to minimize the danger to the rest of his brigade, sent some of his troops from the 69th Pennsylvania to occupy the buildings on the right and use their accurately aimed rifles to damage the rebel line and relieve some of the rest of his men. However, the men from Washington artillery found their range on the building and turned them into a wreck, as one soldier described it. While this was going on, Colonel Norman Hall's brigade formed up to the right and rear of Owen's men. It was about 3 p.m. when Hall's men stepped off. The 19th Massachusetts, preemptive of the order, dashed across the mill race first. Its ranks got hit by a combination of lead and iron, which drove the men back through the ranks of their comrades. Therefore, when the sister regiments moved, they were late in the advance, and when the 20th Massachusetts and 59th New York made it to within rifle range, the North Carolinians hit them in each flank. Finally, the 19th made it into line, but on the far left, the 7th Michigan, unanchored, took enfilading fire and gave way. This exposed the 42nd New York's flank, and this caused a domino effect, with all the regiments falling back to the swell. The 20th did stubbornly fight, not wanting to give up the ground and risk being shot on the withdrawal, but they too were obliged to fall back. Hall, doing as he was instructed to do, rallied his men and attempted another advance. This time it was the New Yorkers in the center who broke first, sending the rest of the line back to the swell to seek cover. In the meantime, the Federal infantry did receive some artillery support, particularly Hazard's battery. The 20th and 19th Massachusetts regiments were the holdouts of Hall's brigade, with the rest moving toward the rear. With Hall and Owen's men pinned down in the swell, Howard committed his last brigade, that under Colonel Sully. Howard actually divided his brigade, sending the 15th Massachusetts to the left and sending the 19th Maine, 34th New York, and 82nd New York to support Hall, with the 1st Minnesota giving aid to an artillery battery. Sully's men could offer little assistance, especially since Howard had divided it. The brigade's rightmost regiments for the most part didn't move, but held their position. Their ranks did get withered by the long-range artillery fire and bullets that happened to make it to their lines, but they held on to their position, not daring to go into the swell full of dead, dying, and desperate comrades. However, the 15th Massachusetts on the left did receive brutal volleys from muskets and cannons, which depleted their ranks. The 2nd Corps had been decimated in its attempt to dislodge Longstreet's men, and to the dismay of many Federal troops, 2 more corps would try their hand at attacking Marye's Heights. Howard's division was not supposed to attack without support, but General Couch was scared that Hancock and French's men would need the reinforcements before his own support could make it to the field. General Orlando Wilcox's 9th Corps was supposed to form up on Howard's left, but the early attack prevented that junction. Now Ferrero's brigade of Sturgis's division of the 9th Corps assembled for its own attack. A soldier from New Hampshire wrote, "The fire in our front was rapidly growing hotter and hotter. The harsh notes of the cannon shook the ground and reverberated among the hills. I could look up to the enemy's works just at our left and see the guns belch forth long sheets of flame and hear the crashing of shells as they struck in our lines." In an attempt to relieve their embattled comrades in the swell, Ferrero's men advanced in splendid style across the field, taking heavy casualties the entire way. When they passed the swell, Owen, part of whose brigade was hunkered down in the swell, attempted to reform his units, but before they could assemble, Ferrero's men were butchered and they fell back to the swell. It was a horrible sight, as the gray line behind the stone wall shot out a constant sheet of flame. Ferrero rode to Sturgis and begged him to send more troops to save his brigade. The 51st New York, who had been detached from Ferrero to guard an artillery battery, stepped up to the suicidal task. Despite the grim situation, many were eager to help their fellow comrades. They began their march, meeting the same fate as their comrades, and once they made it to the swell, got pinned down as well, unable to move. James Nagel's brigade was next to enter the fray. He had 2 regiments on the right of the railroad and 3 on the left of it. They dashed across the field, but the leftmost regiments found themselves in an unfinished railroad cut, while the right regiments received debilitating fire from the rebel guns out in the open. Nagel went over to the 3 units and ordered them out of the cut, but the majority would not move from their safe position. The 7th Rhode Island and the 6th New Hampshire took a heavy cannonading as they attempted to cross a fence, and once they reached the swell, came under devastating volleys of musketry and were obliged to lie down with the rest of the troops. The 6th was staying somewhat together, so Nagel again tried to pry his men from the railroad cut. The 9th New Hampshire and the 12th Rhode Island followed orders and came out of their hiding place, but the hail of lead brought the units to a standstill within 100 feet of the stone wall. The men trickled back to the swell, some running the chance of getting shot in the back by running all the way back to the town. On the Confederate side, the 3rd South Carolina Battalion moved across Hazel Run in order to fire on the blue troops hunkered down in the railroad cut. The Union 2nd Corps and part of the 9th had tried and failed to dislodge the Confederates, but as fighting had died down on the Union left, Ambrose Burnside wanted to make another effort against the Gray Line. He ordered in part of Daniel Butterfield's 5th Corps to attack the stone wall. Barnes' brigade of Griffin's division of that corps formed up outside of the town. A strange order came to the commander of the 18th Massachusetts that he may charge if he wanted to. Its commander saw the fruitless efforts of other regiments and declined to, but through a series of aides carrying orders to the regiment, it was ordered to charge by itself, getting hit by musketry and artillery fire, who found the lonely regiment too appetizing not to fire upon it. It fell back quickly to the safety of the town. The rest of Barnes' men conducted a wheeling motion to cross the railroad track, then wheeled the other way to make their way up to the open fields toward the stone wall. The 2nd Maine, who had entered the unfinished railroad cut, did not move from their position, while the rest made it to the swell and again got pinned down. The 118th Pennsylvania sprinted for the rear, but they were not alone for long. The rest of Barnes' men pulled back to safety, and some remained in the swell, too afraid to leave. Behind them was the brigade of Jacob Schweitzer, a Pennsylvania-born gentleman of German ancestry. He was a lawyer before the war, but had rose through the ranks fairly quickly. He formed his brigade in 2 lines, and as they got closer to the swell, a rush of soldiers exited the swell, headed for the rear, and broke up the integrity of his lines. The chaotic nature of the retreating blue troops caused the 62nd Pennsylvania to waver and break apart. Schweitzer had to quickly reassemble them. Also making things more complicated for him was that Carroll's brigade of the 3rd Corps moved onto the field. Their battle lines collided into one another, causing communication problems and formations broke down. Carroll ultimately pulled his men back to the railroad cut from whence they came. Schweitzer's men finally made it to the swell. Determined to carry out his orders and break the Confederate line, Schweitzer found a 2nd Corps officer still in the swell and suggested that they all move toward the stone wall, but there was no moving the blue troops. But the officer took Schweitzer to the left of the line and pointed him toward the end of the stone wall and told him that that would be the place to attack. Schweitzer, mounted on his horse, stuck his sword through his hat and led his men to the left. His horse was shot out from under him, and he received a nasty leg wound. Nevertheless, his men attempted to advance, but the withering fire from the rebels prevented them from advancing too far, and they fell back. Behind them was Carroll's men. They fixed bayonets and stormed over the railroad cut. Once they made it to the swell, they geared themselves up for the advance to the stone wall. With a yell, the brigade streamed over the crest and charged up to the wall. They could not withstand the volleys unprotected, and pulled back. General Joseph Hooker, appalled at the scenes of carnage playing out on the slopes of Mary's Heights, rode to Burnside and begged him to call off any further attacks, but the Army commander was determined to break the Confederate line at the stone wall. It was around 4:30 p.m. when the brigade of Colonel Stockton and 2 brigades of Humphreys' division formed up outside the town of Fredericksburg. On the Union left, Stockton ordered a bugle call for his brigade to move, but the 17th and 12th New York did not hear the call and stayed put, while the other 4 regiments moved. However, the 20th Maine and the 44th New York got slowed down by fences in their way. The 83rd Pennsylvania and the 16th Michigan made it to the swell first and moved to the left to help protect the men in the swell, but it only exposed their flank, which got raked with lead from Kershaw's South Carolinians. The 20th Maine and 44th New York made it into the swell as well. They exchanged musketry with the rebels, but had to find protection along with the rest of the demoralized blue troops. Lagging far behind, 12th and 17th New York finally made it into the swell, but their numbers did little to help the situation. On the right, Humphreys' men, divided by a road, prepared for their advance. In one of the most heroic displays of the war, General Humphreys rode in front of his division to lead it as to inspire his men, who had just witnessed numerous regiments fail to take the position. Alabac's brigade moved out first, with their division commander encouraging them every step of the way. They made it into the swell, and Humphreys was able to convince them to advance against the Confederates. They exchanged musketry with Philip's Legion until Humphreys' horse was shot out from under him. He began cussing the rebels for killing his $1,700 horse, and then borrowed another one to ride to Tyler's brigade and personally lead it into battle. Alabac's men settled into a prone yet somewhat protected location in front of the stone wall, returning fire when possible. Tyler's men advanced without firing a shot by order of Humphreys, who realized that rifle fire did little to damage the Confederate line. He wanted his men to use the bayonet. However, Tyler's men disobeyed orders once they got to within rifle range of the stone wall and stopped to fire. The momentum was gone, and the lead flew from the rebel guns. Tyler and his men had to fall back along with Alabac's men. Darkness was starting to cover the battlefield, and Burnside had still not dislodged the Confederates from Marye's Heights, so he committed parts of 2 more divisions, those under George Sykes and George Getty. Sykes formed up across the mill race, but never received orders to advance. Getty, on the other hand, did. Hawkins' brigade attacked the rebels from the south. The 10th New Hampshire at first did not move out with the rest of the brigade because of a miscommunication, but caught up to the rest of the regiments. The 25th New Jersey broke in two, with the right side advancing further. The 13th Rhode Island sandwiched themselves between the two halves of the 25th New Jersey. By the time the blue troops made their advance, it was fairly dark, so much so that neither side could see each other. Nevertheless, the South Carolinians fired volleys into the darkness, and the chaos from the musketry forced Hawkins back. The day ended with one of the most brutally lopsided battles of the American Civil War. The scene on the slopes and in the swell horrified veterans of the battle until their death, and many never forgave Burnside for ordering those attacks. Many soldiers described it as simply murder. At around 3 p.m. on December 13th, while Union brigades hurled themselves at the Confederate-held stone wall on Marye's Heights, a small engagement erupted where Jackson and Longstreet's corps met. Brigadier General Dorsey Pender's brigade held the extreme left of Jackson's line, and Brigadier General George T. Anderson occupied the extreme right of Longstreet's line. Brigadier General Evander Law was in the reserve. On the Union side, Brigadier General William T. Brooks's division of William F. Smith's 6th Corps occupied the position across from the Confederate center. Both sides wanted to maintain control of the railroad. Confederate Captain Joseph Latimer's 5 pieces of artillery sat in an open area lobbing shells at Union infantry and artillery. So far in that sector, only skirmishing had transpired, mostly between the 16th North Carolina and the 15th New Jersey, across the railroad tracks. When the men from New Jersey put some well-placed shots in amongst the artillerymen, driving the cannoneers away from their guns, the 16th North Carolina rushed to the railroad tracks, but the Union troops put up a stubborn fight and took expert aim at the Tar Heels, who dared to cross the railroad tracks. Smith became worried that the 15th might be flanked if more Confederate troops moved up, so he dispatched the 4th New Jersey to the 15th's left. The quick movement of the Federal troops, along with the Confederates taking heavy casualties, sent the 16th North Carolina back in a full withdrawal. Now Latimer's guns were in severe danger of being captured, or at the very least maimed by the well-placed bullets of the men from New Jersey. Evander Law, viewing the situation, saw the Tar Heels pulling back from their position and ordered his brigade to support the artillery. Latimer informed Law that the Federals needed driven from the front before his cannoneers could retake their position, so Law, instead of sending in his veterans, sent in the newest additions to his brigade at the urgence of their individual commanders. The 54th and 57th North Carolina infantry regiments dashed up to the railroad. The 57th's colonel, Archibald Godwin, all 6 feet 6 inches of him, went at the double quick with his regiment, flag in hand, leading the new troops into combat. Torbert, the brigade commander for the New Jersey regiments, became worried that a full-on engagement was developing, but also worried that his men would get flanked, so he deployed the 23rd New Jersey. The two sides threw lead at one another from as close as 30 yards. The close quarters fighting created heavy casualties for the short engagement. Torbert called for more reinforcements before he committed the 23rd, and when he became fully engaged, those troops made their appearance. Evander Law saw the approaching Federals and decided to recall his Tar Heels. He had lost nearly 300 men, killed, wounded, captured, and missing in just that short amount of time. And since neither side wanted to bring on a full engagement, the quick fight turned to skirmishing once again. In the waning hours of the bloody day, Stonewall Jackson hoped that the Federal columns would attack his lines again, just like they did against Longstreet's, but the attacks did not materialize. Jackson therefore planned to launch an attack of his own to drive the Union infantry into the river and destroy what could not escape. He planned for his entire corps to attack the Union left. D.H. Hill received his orders, but Sandy Pendleton, one of Jackson's staff, was wounded carrying the orders to Tolliver, who never received word to prepare for an assault. A.P. Hill received his orders after dark, but they were rudimentary. The staffer simply stated for Hill to advance his men, with no specifics of when or where. The aide delivering orders to Early got lost, so he only found out about the assault when D.H. Hill's men came marching past him. Early found Jackson and explained that his troops were scattered all over Prospect Hill, so Jackson ordered him to advance with what men he could quickly organize. The disorganized assault columns formed up and stepped off. Jackson explained, "The first gun had hardly moved forward from the wood 100 yards when the enemy's artillery reopened, and so completely swept our front as to satisfy me that the proposed movement should be abandoned." On the Union side, Ambrose Burnside convened a council of war, where he decided that he would personally lead an attack against Marye's Heights with his own 9th Corps. The senior officers attempted to convince him otherwise, but his mind was made up, and it would take place at 10 a.m. the next morning. The next morning, as time for the assault drew closer, General Sumner advised the Army commander to desist from the attack. Burnside agreed to call it off. Over the course of December 14th and into the 15th, Union and Confederate soldiers scoured the battlefield, looking for their dead and wounded. On the 15th, Burnside decided to retreat back across the Rappahannock. When the retreat was well underway, Burnside received word from Washington that Major General Henry Halleck disapproved of the crossing of the river, but it was too late to reverse course now. The battle had officially ended. The Union lost 12,653 men, 1,284 killed, 9,600 wounded, and 1,769 captured or missing. The Confederacy lost 5,309 troops, 592 killed, 4,061 wounded, and 653 captured or missing. This brought the Battle of Fredericksburg to a total of 17,962 for both sides. A joint congressional committee reviewed the problems with the battle that many called simply murder, and they ultimately pinned the defeat on General Franklin for his lack of aggression on the Confederate right. When he heard that Lincoln, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and Halleck were bearing the brunt of the criticism, Burnside wrote a letter that placed the blame squarely on his own shoulders. Burnside would not concede defeat during this campaign just yet. He planned a few days after the battle to launch an attack across the river further downstream, but those plans fell through. He went to work on another plan to occur in January. Sumner would hold the Confederates in place at Fredericksburg, while Hooker and Franklin crossed at Banks Ford and United States Ford respectively. From there, the two would push into the rear of the Army of Northern Virginia, taking advantage of the enemy's sparsed-out dispositions. Sumner would also put pressure on them at Fredericksburg. It was a bold plan, and if done quickly, would catch Robert E. Lee off guard. January 19th was cool but sunny. The Grand Division commanders implemented the plan on January 20th, but by 7 p.m. a heavy rain set in, a nor'easter, which grounded the march to a halt. Infantry were used to pull wagons carrying supplies and pontoon bridges, and artillery out of the mud. The engineers reported to Burnside that the pontoon bridges that he asked to be built across the river would not be completed for another day or so. The Army commander knew that giving Robert E. Lee that much time would allow Lee to maneuver his troops to firmly resist a crossing of the river, so the campaign was called off, and the Fredericksburg campaign officially ended.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.